Welcome to the Children in Scotland podcast. In this episode, we hear from Professor Richard Rose about therapeutic life story work, including the methodology, successes, and future plans.
Why do you feel so passionate about therapeutic life story work?
Well, I guess that the drive that I have with life story work is just seeing the difference it makes to families when a young person who doesn't really understand their story and sometimes doesn't understand why they live where they live can actually start to make sense of that, realise that some of those things have happened, weren't as a result of their behaviour or because they weren't loved or liked, and then releasing children from that kind of definition of the past being who they are to the opportunity to be who they wish to be. And the passion really is just watching these children and young people become all they can be. So that's the main reason. And that's something that, unlike many jobs, you see the beginning, middle and end. So, you start in chaos, you may end up in, challenging spaces, but seemingly at the end, you always end up with something that's been worthy for us, but also helpful for the child.
And if someone was interested in taking this course, who would you say it would benefit?
For the individual taking the course, I think anyone that's really had an experience of working with young people or adults where they've been left confused about the presentation of that person, or maybe where you've done some counselling or maybe some therapeutic intervention, but you feel that there is more opportunity in that notion of storytelling. So somebody with confidence, somebody that's got an interest in kind of storytelling as such. I think anyone that's kind of worked with children where they can see the best of that child, but they're curious about how they can get that best to be the child. So I would say probably who would benefit most? Social workers that are maybe in their role but not particularly engaged in the role anymore. Certainly family support workers. People like, for instance, foster carers, adoptive parents who've got lots of experience, who are now thinking of what can I do with all this experience? How might I be able to fashion an intervention that would be meaningful? And then I would say teachers, and certainly, in my experience anyway, those in residential care, those people who are, well, like me, when I was interested in life story work, I'm a child protection worker at the time, and seeing, the hurt or seeing the outcome of hurt without being able to be involved in the kind of recovery. So if it's somebody that just wants to see, the best in people, this is a really good way of getting that opportunity.
Any reflections on the findings from the Australian research paper?
Well, one, very, very pleased. It wasn't something that was, oh my gosh, I don't believe it. It was more, oh my gosh, it's now evident. So when I first started doing this work in 97, I know that it was frowned on a little bit because why would children need to know their past? It's been awful, it's terrible. Talking about it will give them more trauma. And of course, that's just not the case. And in fact, there's adults that don't talk to children about those hurts that are actually saying to a child, it's too much even for me. And so I think that certainly when it comes to the research findings, what was joyous about them really was the group that they worked with were residential older children who were all at risk of harm through exploitation or through adults taking advantage of what, were really very hurt young people whose, kind of internal model was, I'm not worthy, I'm not lovable. And then, kind of as we see in, this country with county lines and exploitation, both financially and sexually, that, if you have a child with low self-esteem and offer that child something that looks like esteem, they'll do whatever they need to do it. And so what we found in the research was that if an adult could walk alongside a child to bear witness to their story, to hold that child and their carer, together to explore, to share lives, share stories, that what happens is that those, ghosts of the past, if you like, are suddenly understood, no more powerful. And because they're no longer powerful and drive the young person, they don't need the behaviours they've used to protect themselves. And this research showed us this. So, for instance, children who would be really struggling in school with friendships or, sitting in a classroom are often overwhelmed children with their trauma. If we help them to make sense of their hurts, they're no longer overwhelmed by the trauma. They now have capacity to make and maintain friends, to sit in a classroom for a longer period without being overwhelmed because of the hurts they're carrying. So in the research, for instance, there was a massive improvement for children's ability to get on alongside their peers to improve in school. What was really lovely, and when we know this in the sense of the practice, but in the evidence of seeing carers who are often under so much pressure from their young people's reaction to their trauma, that once we work together with the young person and their carer, that trauma becomes understood, that trauma becomes less powerful, that trauma becomes something that we learn to live alongside rather than allowing it to overwhelm us. And then what happens is that, families begin to enjoy time, enjoy opportunities, enjoy, what life does have to offer without the kind of arguments or the standoffs or the safe behaviours we often see our children display. So all those are in that research. But the best thing for me, really, was that of the children that took part in that research, all those children recommended that their colleagues should do the same. And when children recommend to other children, this is something worthwhile doing, then you have something worthwhile.
Yeah, I was actually almost in tears reading some of the things that the students had to say about the experience. It was very touching. So this is Therapeutic Life Story Work International's 10th year.
Yes.
Where do you see it going in the next 5 years?
Well, there's a question. Well, I'm supposed to be retiring, but not just yet, apparently. But where do I see it going? Well, I mean, we're in a cusp of something very special now. So for the last 5 years or so, we've been trying to get accreditation for our courses. It's very hard in the current climate to do this because where universities used to be happy to validate courses if they were run very well, there wasn't this validation happening. And so in a way, what we had was I think most people that do the course have very, great things to say about their journey on the course, but there was not that kind of feeling of creditable course. It's not like a thing that you could hold out and say, look what I have. I'm really pleased now that we've got that. So we have our certified practitioner, we have our reason now to say, yes, we're credited, which is fantastic. And now that's done, and now that Life Story Work in this model of practice, which I find difficult to say rose model, but anyway, rose model of practice, what we find is that people are now choosing this as an intervention of choice, but also asking for this model, which is brilliant. But the next 5 years, in a month's time, I'll be announcing that we are going to launch our academy. So the academy will be within Therapeutic Life Story Work. It will look at research, publication. It will also consider areas such as training and best practice. The Academy will run TLSW, as in the programme, in partnership with Children in Scotland, partnership with Berry Street and so on in other countries. But we'll also develop other courses now, which I know need to be on the agenda. So we would love to run a therapeutic social work course, and we would love to run a course around working with sexual harm and sexual harmful behaviours, because so much we need to learn, but there are so many good ways we can practice with confidence. So the Academy will look at new courses over the next few years. They will look at journal publications once every 6 months, and they will also be launching its own research arm. So it's all exciting times.
What aspects of the course do attendees find the most interesting or inspiring?
The course itself is split into 4 blocks. And the first block is really a bit of a, oh my gosh, time. We didn't realise it was this ordered, this kind of systemic, that it's grounded in so much theory. And I think it kind of is great for people attending the first 3 days to see a model that is informed. So that's exciting. But it's not really where the real learning is. And that's where the groups start to formate. And so the second block is really where I think the reality of the work comes into play. Lots of group activities, lots of sharing of practice, of learning, lots of connections being made between the students who are on the course, but also looking at the the reality of doing the work and the kind of sheer fear, really, of talking to children about things like death and sex and all those things, when actually we demystify that. And we get in that second block, a lot of very aware, maybe alert students of, can I do this? And by the end of the second block saying, hey, actually I can do this. So that's great. The third block is our conundrum block. It's where we start to think about cases in the real. And this is one where I personally enjoy the most. We talk a lot about attachment and trauma. We talk a lot about real life situations. And it's where people really start to think about the complex nature of the work we do and understanding that simple is as simple does. And then the last block, people get into quite sad situations. They sometimes don't want it to end. The 12 days go so quickly. But in that last block, it's where you sew up all the learning. And by sewing up the learning, what we end up doing is starting to have these aha moments. So, for instance, we're on the last day of the Scotland block, and I can't tell you how many times the 20 students we have in that room have said collectively and individually, I get it. And sometimes, it's good to sew that at the end, because it means all the way through the start and the middle, we're beginning to change our practice, change our sense of doing. And we hope with all the other value-added opportunities we offer through membership, through the CPD, through supervision, that it's the start of their journey and the start of any new student's journey, which, like I say, will lend itself to, as long as people want it to be, lifelong learning.
As you mentioned just there, Therapeutic Life Story Work explores some really difficult topics. So how do you find joy in the face of such things?
Well, I think that because sometimes as adults we want to protect our children, we want to protect those around us, and so we often eggshell. But in reality, the person we're working with are not wanting eggshells. They're wanting to talk about these things. And it's not necessarily the joy of talking about these complex issues. It's the kind of realization of the ability to talk about these difficult conversations. So, if you say to somebody, for instance, right, I want you to go and talk to a child about the death of their mother. I mean, that's a big thing, Where do you start? But in this work, what we would do is we would think, well, okay, what is it that actually is the context of the death? What was the lead up to? What was the actual concept and what happened afterwards? How can we break down the story into bite-sized chunks so that we could start to introduce the notion of, loss and grief and so on? And then we learn scripting. And so we could learn how to script a particular piece of difficult news. And then what do we do with that script? So, for instance, if I give you an example, a child I worked with not that long ago now, and we had to explore this child about the death of her sister. She didn't know she had a sister. And this is why she's in adoption. So she's been in adoption for a long time. She doesn't know the real reason why she's in adoption, other than, there were problems when she was with her birth family. And my job was to tell her about the fact her sister had been killed by her father. And that's a hard thing, if you think about it, right from the very beginning. How do you even start that conversation? But actually, once you get the confidence of a young person, once you understand that young person's, social, cognition, emotional ability, you can then fashion the story around her ability to listen, to make sense. And then you create a kind of a narrative, a script. So her script was something like, when I was little, the social service were worried about me not being safe at home. The reason they were worried was because my dad had done something very bad, and he's in prison now for doing this bad thing. I know that my dad killed somebody. What I didn't know was that my dad had killed my sister, and I didn't even know I had a sister. Richard's helped me understand what happened, and that the reason I was moved away from my family was because nobody wanted me to be hurt. Now I know about my sister, I can now think about what that means and hopefully make sense of, why now I live where I live. I'm glad I'm safe. And that's a script, you see. Now, from that script, she might then go on to say, well, I want to know why my dad did this and why my dad didn't do it to me. And I can turn around and say, well, you were in your mummy's womb. And so when you were born into the world, you were taken straight away. So, in fact, Daddy didn't have an opportunity to be with you. If Daddy did want to hurt you, he couldn't because you were protected. And then we'd look at, well, what is safe? What does that look like? And we might do like an acrostic of safe, which is, S is to be, secure, A to be attached, F to be family safe, E to be eye-catched, yeah? And then the idea here is that what we're doing for our young people is helping them to understand, it's not your fault that Dad did these things. But she might go on to say, but why did Daddy do this to my sister? And then we might go into that, and we might turn around and say, well, when your daddy was very young, there were lots of things happening in his life, which meant that he was very, very angry at the world. And sometimes when you're very angry at the world, it's hard to stop being angry, even to the things you need to protect. And she might turn around and say, well, that's just like me. And I'll go, what do you mean? Well, sometimes I'm really angry at my mum and I hit her. I don't really want to hit her, but I get so angry inside. And of course, that was the reason I was working with her, because she attacks her carers. Do you see how it works? Mm-hmm. So now she's getting an understanding, a narration of that understanding. And then by helping her to do that kind of thinking through, that making sense through, something very hard that sounds impossible suddenly isn't impossible. And that's how we do it.
So would you say that it's the joy comes from exploring compassion? And
I think the joy comes from humanistic, very much positive regard, that we don't know what life was like for a mum or a dad or somebody that may have hurt a child we're working with. We can't knock people off their pedestals. We can't turn around and almost kill off a carer or a parent. That doesn't work. But actually, they probably don't deserve to be killed off. There are always ways in which we can try and make sense of things. It's, in my opinion, after 40 years of social work now almost, that it's unusual to come across somebody that will hurt somebody just because they want to hurt somebody. I know it happens, but it's unusual. Usually there is a story behind the hurt, which may be the story of their own hurt, or it may be unresolved issues. And so, without boring you too much, I talk a lot about ghosts and monsters. And the best way to explain this in a nutshell is that if you're very, very young and you see chaos around you, and you see your parents hurting each other, you are wary of not having food consistently, your routine of being cared for, you still survive that. You still find a way to survive. And what happens there is that you're surviving in a way by creating coping strategies that keep you safe. And often those strategies are learned from your parent providers. So we look at Bandura, for instance, social learning. So when I'm older and maybe I don't live in that family anymore and I live in a new family, well, when I get angry or when I feel like I'm at risk, then I'll do what I know works for me, which might mean I get really angry, or it might be that I get very sweary, or I might get very uncontained. But it's not because I'm terrible or I'm awful or I'm horrible. It's because my body now knows what I need to do to keep myself safe. And so none of us really who look after children or work with monsters. We just work with children who've had monstrous things happen. And if that's the case, then obviously those monstrous things that have happened to them still to some extent drive our children. And so these behaviours often will manifest when our children feel unsafe. So if we can accept the behaviour as it is without condoning it, understand through compassion that this is the way they keep safe, but also think, how can we help this child? So let's look at the roots of their story, the story that has evolved them, and see whether those roots, which are, their roots to their behaviour, are still connected, or whether some of those roots are no longer powerful or no longer part of their story. And so in Therapeutic Life Story Work, that's what we do. We look at the roots as ghosts. And if the ghosts are, active in that child's space, then every time the ghost is appearing, the child reacts. But if we can disarm the ghost, if we can make the ghost understood but no longer unresolved, the behaviours aren't needed. And that's kind of what we do. And the best way of describing that is just, we use what we call a behaviour tree. So when we look at behaviours of children, we write all those behaviours down, good and bad and difficult. And then we look at the roots of those behaviours, which is the child's experience. And if we then kind of drew grass above the roots, so above all the sexual harm and the domestic violence and alcohol and drug issues, etc., we cover that up with grass and a tree trunk to join the leaves. Often what we see with our children is just the presenting issues. But if we open our hearts to what drives those issues, we can understand why they're presenting issues. Therefore, if we look at those roots, and one child, for instance, I worked with, who'd been horrendously hurt in a sexual way by family, she still carries that hurt. So she behaves in a way which is quite sexual. And people treat her as though she's a sexual risk. Well, actually, if you look at her story, it's nothing to do with sex. Because she has understood that when she does act sexually, adults get wary, adults back off, adults become a little bit overwhelmed, which means that for a moment she's safe. And so in a placement she was in when I met with her, she had a single female carer who was, all her world. But whenever the female carer brought a friend home for a cup of tea, this friend is a threat to this child. She's only 5, they're an adult. How does she get rid of an adult? How does she get rid of this threat? Well, all she does is become sexually behaving, i.e. trying to touch, trying to show, all that kind of stuff. And your average adult will get out quite quickly, and I know I would. And of course what that means is the child says, hey, this works. So the next time something happens that threatens her, what have I got in my arsenal that I can keep safe? I've got this behaviour. And this is why this work's so important, and why when you say around exploring difficult situations, it's the adults sometimes that make it difficult. So, maybe back to that Faulberg concept we talked about, which is the very fact that adults hesitate to talk to children about difficult things implies to the child even the adult can't cope. But they've lived this stuff. They're living this stuff. So an adult helping them to make sense of it might be the best thing you could ever do.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to the Children in Scotland podcast. To find out more about all of our work, including our learning and events programme, head to our website at childreninscotland.org.uk.